What if I told you there was a team-based multiplayer battle arena dodgeball game? Well, first off, you probably wouldn't believe me. But as a fan growing up of dodgeball myself, me and many others were taken by surprise as well when Knockout City burst onto the scene back in May of 2021. Developed by Villain Studios, the studio behind Mario Kart Live, and published by Electronic Arts. Knockout City came out swinging, no pun intended, reaching over 2 million players in short time. But even though the game was both beloved by fans and critics, within a year of the game's launch, it would move to free-to-play, and then one more year, if that, it was shut down. Well, that's kind of the mystery we solve here in the series. Death of a Game, a series where we investigate why a company or game is dead or dying by utilizing a timeline of events in which we gather clues and bits of evidence, finally culminating in a, well, final deduction. Every detective's key moment of the mystery where we elucidate the case. And just like Knockout City burst onto the scene and disappeared in a jiffy, let's get to the case pronto. I would like to welcome this video's sponsor, Fume. What is Fume? Fume is an award-winning flavored air device. You grab your Fume device, insert your flavor, and the Fume device draws flavor to your mouth. Fume can fill a void ditching a bad habit can leave, because it gives you something to still reach for that's not actually a vape. That's right, there's no vapor. You can use it anywhere. There's no nicotine either, so it's not addictive, and it has non-toxic flavors. It really is a guilt-free alternative. There's no batteries in the device, so you'll never need to charge it, and it looks cool. You can feel the weighted, high-quality design just by looking at it. And best of all, for people like me who are pretty ADD, it's made to be fidgeted with, calms anxiety with magnets, snaps and clicks, and allows you to adjust the airflow dial into your mic, and makes a satisfying sound when you do it. Fume has served over 300,000 customers, and you can be the next success story. This holiday season, you can give the gift of better habits with Fume. Head to tryfume.com/nerdslayer and use code nerdslayer to get a free Fume topper when you order a journey pack. It's the perfect addition to make your gift even more special. And if you're lucky, you could even win one of the Fume's limited edition gold-plated devices this holiday season. Again, tryfume.com/nerdslayer or just scan the QR code on screen to grab yours and now make someone else's holiday unforgettable. The story begins with the launching of a private video game developer, Villain Studios, founded by the Bala brothers, who also founded Vicarious Visions yet left back in 2016. Villain Studios would successfully raise capital to fund the first project, which would be none other than Mario Kart Live, a custom Mario Kart track maker game utilizing augmented reality features. This was a natural transition of a sort though, with Vicarious Visions handling a lot of the popular IP properties and most recently at the time, the Skylander franchise, a kid-friendly collectible franchise that had a video game component. Mario Kart Live would prove to be a huge contract secured for Villain Studios, and Nintendo would leverage their AR experience and create a Mario Kart AR experience. Mario Kart Live is a augmented reality version of Mario Kart, or at least somewhat. Essentially, you could map out your own room in your house as a track in Mario Kart, and although the idea was novel and quite neat, as it involved the use of a remote-controlled toy that could be then digitally rendered, it wasn't the best executed as the game was not a fully fledged Mario Kart title, meaning that it was treated and felt like in some ways a spin-off title despite bearing the Mario Kart name. A very expensive spin-off title, I might add, that required you to actually utilize and set up real remote-controlled race cars. And if you wanted to play with other people, you needed to get another car. Still, although overall, Mario Kart was considered a flop, it still sold 1.7 million copies, showing that 35 years into their run, Mario Kart counts nearly 2 million in sales as a flop. What success. And by the way, that's at $100 a pop. Wowzas. Villain Studios would move on to their next project, offering very little coverage or updates to Mario Kart Live. Though, in their defense, that was probably more on Nintendo's side since they would have to pivot back to the previous Mario Kart as a main focus anyway. Rock, Paper, Shotgun and a hands-on with detail in their impressions that Knockout City, as it was being dubbed, Villain Studios' second game, was a dodgeball arena battler multiplayer game. According to Villain, dodgeball was chosen due to its popularity as a sport and broad appeal. The twist in Knockout City, besides a 3v3 focus, was not only could you throw dodgeballs at each other, there were actually special dodgeballs such as the moon ball that granted zero gravity effects or the bomb ball which would explode on a timer. And as the article states, you. Yeah, you heard that right. You could also be used as a ball and thrown at your opponents. In a unique mechanic, players in Knockout City can pick each other up and throw them for a full-blown knockout. You can even charge up fully for a devastating explosive ball. Successful throws aren't really about accuracy as much as they are about timing and positioning. Players can dodge or even catch a ball thrown at them, to which they can then return fire with. And you will full-on respawn once you are hit twice. Faking throws is another wrinkle of the complexity of the combat, on top of the ability to tackle other opponents who are holding balls. Holding balls. Knockout City was light on the lore and world exposition, but it featured a cast of colorful looking characters and avatars, and obviously was slanted more towards a young audience. Felon Studios clearly wanted to appeal to as many players as possible, and while making sure to appeal to your player base is important, sometimes you will struggle to appeal to anyone at all if you try too hard to appeal to everyone. Felon being venture funded likely had something to do with this, as their money was coming from elsewhere, where an ROI was expected. Knockout City would launch May 21st, 2012 on nearly all platforms, published by Electronic Arts. Oops, that's kind of the part that I didn't really mention except in the intro. EA would bring, likely, more financial expectations, let's be honest. But contrary to popular belief from my sources, generally they are more of the give you the rope to hang yourself with type than just being straight up unreasonable. Knockout City would score a respectable 80 out of 100 from 26 different critics on aggregate review website Metacritic, and reach 85% very positive on Steam from 8,405 user reviews. Destructoid in their review would rate the game an impressive 8 out of 10, stating they were really shocked with how well the game turned out and said that it was easily the biggest surprise of 2021, with their main points of enjoyment coming from the gameplay itself, and their distaste being directed towards the visual style, which they felt was a futuristic 50s style that took some getting used to. And I have to agree, I personally find it a bit conflicting, as it both looks like a glossy and greasy, kind of like Grease the movie, and yet obviously intended for children with its color palette and visual style. The art style, frankly, is one of the most disliked aspects of the game, according to my testimonies. The IGN review would give Knockout City an even more impressive 9 out of 10, and would echo the negatives of the visual style while focusing a lot more on the positive, like the Destructoid review, such as calling Knockout City one of the best team-based games to come out in years, which was a lofty title. And one I don't know if you can necessarily make before it's been enough time for it to be out, because multiplayer games take time to cook. IGN would argue that it was impressive that Felon Studios lowered the mechanical skill ceiling, but still managed to make a fun and compelling team-based game. And well, I'm inclined to agree. Knockout City would launch with 5 maps and 6 modes, which would swell up to double that by the end of its dev cycle. Now, 6 modes is an awful lot of modes for only 5 maps, and if I could offer some criticism, I think it probably has to do with the fact that they weren't fully sold on which mode was their main mode. If you've watched the series before, you've seen this before. What is a main mode? Well, when you don't have a main mode, what happens is a game developer can try to workshop a bunch of modes in an attempt to choose a direction. The issue being is that their game isn't made specifically for those particular modes, as much as it's just being altered by those modes slightly, or those modes are then being lifted from other games and put into their game. Take Valorant into example. A game like that is made for last stand, round-based, search and destroy mechanics, and yet it also has a very popular deathmatch mode. But it wasn't made for deathmatch. It's a subtle difference, but a difference nonetheless that could make the difference. The biggest kicker yet to be mentioned, however, in typical video game journalist fashion, because these outlets often neglect to mention the most important part of this puzzle, or case even. Oftentimes, video game journalists get copies for free. This makes them ignore or miss that particular fact. And that's that Knockout City was asking for $20 a pop. Sure, there was a trial you could play, but by contrast, Fortnite was free, and Minecraft is $10 more because in modern times it raised the price. It was the same price years ago. EA Publishing would allow them to offer the EA Play. That would allow you to play the game while paying monthly, but this is not really a good deal in this case, because EA Play is, in this case, a quarter or more of the game's cost, which already makes you feel like you aren't getting that much value if you just get EA Play to get Knockout City. And finally, Splatoon, which the game was often compared to due to the team aspects and auto-lock aspects of the combat and the fact that it was clearly made for kids, was that Splatoon was a full-price game, but a major Nintendo title, and treated like that. It already had a sequel and another one on the way at this time, with the second game selling a whopping 13.6 million copies. However, Splatoon has a single player as well, and despite what you might think at first glance, it's actually a deceptively complicated game. I've tested both Splatoon 2 and Splatoon 3 at different video game conventions, including E3, rest in peace. Although some comments will mention that they feel like Knockout City is similar because they think it also has a deceptively complicated skill cap, but it doesn't actually. And that's due to a couple of factors, like the inability to out your opponent from a catch, like how aiming doesn't really matter at all. And the problem is it turns proper dodgeball, in this case, in a game, emphasizing on the first part of it more so than the rest. Dodging. You can endlessly dodge in Knockout City, and while this might seem like it matches real life since you're playing in constant movement when you're playing dodgeball, otherwise you're gonna get out, you aren't dodging around in locked animations for brief seconds. It makes the combat seem a bit disjointed and kind of silly, on top of the ability to melee attack your opponents even existing in the first place. Like sure, game aspects were going to be introduced and things were going to change, like throwing your teammate as a ball, which is hilarious, but removing skill aspects and then adding in some strange ones was perplexing for me and many others. Catching a ball for an out and dodgeball is a central part of the game's dynamism. You can't misunderstand that, because it also allows you to then bring back your teammates. It's one of the most exciting things in the game to do. In fact, in some dodgeball games in real life, they have a swish hoop or they have a special target where once hit, it fully saves your entire team if they were out. Removing this from the game version, for me, was questionable as a big in real life dodgeball player as an aside. Now back to Splatoon. Splatoon is also not really a game about aiming either, and yet you can definitely aim in the game, as your paint splatters around the map as much as possible to win. In a sense, though, the imperfection of its aim, but still including the aim, was a step above Knockout City, which was essentially locked-on combat. It would be more like playing tag or dodgeball with a water gun. I don't like to compare the titles in the series too much with their big brothers or fierce competitors, especially when many others might not see the connection, but Knockout City in many ways was trying to be Splatoon, but despite its critical reception, wasn't exactly that, and then some. And the cracks would form over time as typical with a multiplayer title. Knockout City, my analysis aside, with the gift of hindsight of course, would reach an impressive 2 million players the same month that it launched. Now, it should be mentioned, for mystery's sakes, this number could also be combining the 1 million players from the open beta, which would be the free players added to the game, to clarify my point. This seems to track because just a year later, and Knockout City was already free to play fully. More than just a shift to free to play, which many felt was needed at launch, but happy it was coming a year after, was that Velan Studios was actually shedding their EA publishing, and would be handling Knockout City on their own from now on. My read on this is that they weren't impressing EA, so they likely bought their way out of their license or contract, so they likely could retain the game in some way or ownership of it and its IP. I think this is actually a smart move personally. It's not something that's commonly done though, and while it might seem like a move of desperation, I think it's commendable that Velan Studios knew that Knockout City wasn't really working, at least not in the form that it was, but they were trying to find a way to make it. Knockout City would get the mainstream appeal they had been desperately searching for with a major Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles crossover that would happen August 22nd, 2023, accompanying their patch 7.0, which would also add a new map, a battle pass, emotes, and ranked league play. This was quite the major update for the game, but though some would argue that it barely brings the game into alignment with other games already at launch, for example Splatoon or Fortnite. This new crossover bundle would include new characters, skins, and a new battle pass. The weird thing is that, and maybe this is like a licensing thing, but they didn't actually feature the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in the trailer showcasing the update. Maybe forgive my lore, but I don't know who these like game-themed characters are, but they're instead of the actual Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle characters that get introduced later on. Now the bummer about this is that the characters look really cool, and when they were introduced in the game, they actually fit. But why weren't they in the trailer? Not only do they fit the world better than the characters that Velan Studios initially designed for it, they actually did the TMT characters justice and the art itself. But to use a licensed and popular IP like this means that you're going to have to pay for it, and thus they have to turn a profit from it, which might explain the crazy $20 price tag. Yeah, you're essentially paying for another game and getting the value of a few loot boxes or purchased skins. This was not a good value proposition for a game people already felt wasn't a good value proposition. Sure, it's free to play now, but what about the players who already bought the game? You aren't pricing the DLC for them, and if you are or were, you did a poor job of it. Knockout City would release the bulk of their first updates as bug fixes and plugging in the gaps their game was missing, more so than adding content, which is understandable. But about 6 months into their cycle, they would start actually adding new content such as maps and new modes. And this was impressive for an indie studio, but probably very hard to keep up with. And as a small company, they were probably sprinting for it, hoping that the success would match that. Fast forward, and patch 8.0 was one of the biggest yet, and it would lay the groundwork for the introduction of the next round of crossovers, featuring TMT again, as well as something entirely novel to the game, PvE. Yeah, they even did it before Overwatch. But seriously, you could now play against bot-controlled NPCs in a variety of noir-themed missions. Boy is the third word from the last. Music to my ears, detectives. Play the music, Tom. One of these such events, dubbed Conflict Escalation, was a 4-phase challenge mode full of a number of contracts that could grant you a number of rewards. Veteran Studios was doing a good job of post-launch support. Well, at the very least working with what they had, and what they created. Patch 8.1 was the proper divorce from EA, with the removal of the EA Origin as a playing option platform, and EA Play naturally as well. The patch also references a revert on a change of taunts, which were basically just added to the game. Now, this is kind of a side point, but that showcases yet again that Veteran Studios was more interested in being family-friendly than a competitive team game. And there's something commendable about their commitment to that, but it must also be acknowledged that this is not in exactly alignment with the rest of gamers, such as myself. Again, going back to Fortnite. Fortnite is plenty goofy, plenty for kids, but plenty competitive. The scheduled new crossover event would take place sometime in January of 2023. This event would introduce another bundle, this time the Villains, featuring none other than Rocksteady and Bebop. And they look great, again. And it should be noted that the art team at Villains seems talented. They just seem to put all of their eggs into one style basket that just didn't resonate, yet they were finding success in their crossovers. This update would add the 2v2 mode against bots, having varying levels of difficulty and styles, but yet again we have a $20 bundle for arguable value. It seemed like this was Veteran Studios trying their best to work with what they could, but we're stuck in a content cycle that wasn't just realistic at all. This is why just months after the release of the new TMT $20 bundle, the game was announced to be shut down, later in the summer, June 6th, 2023. Veteran would state it was an extremely difficult decision to make, but an important one for the studio. Veteran would then go on to state that despite reaching an impressive overall 12 million players, they would struggle to make the serious changes they would need to keep the game afloat simultaneously while also trying to maintain the game in a live format, including adding new content. Especially as a small indie studio who relied on contracts from their publishers or IP holders. Veteran would state that they had desires to return to the Knockout universe, but couldn't promise that they would bring the game itself back. This was remarkably honest by the studio, and makes me more inclined to believe them in their positions, when you're usually just fed that corpo politically correct BS in such posts. Veteran would also state, as expected, the need to move on to another project to pay the bills. And this is a sort of tough situation for indie developers. They don't have the money and resources to keep a game afloat, and they don't have the publisher in this case to do it. With Knockout City now independent, they didn't have anyone paying to keep the lights on, except what they could make and raise for themselves. I understand for some this makes it seem like some developers, like indie developers, are very fleeting with their support, especially for multiplayer games, because they're always able and willing to move on to the next project, seemingly in a jiffy, but I understand that companies like this, and I hope you guys too, are in a difficult pickle, and they're likely making the best with what they have. Veteran Studios would move on to another AR title, one with another quite popular IP, Hot Wheels. It's hard to find the general reception for this game, let alone the critical reception, but it seems like it was called essentially a Mario Kart Live, but for Hot Wheels, without much mention about the innovations. These two games weren't even bad, it's just they had much better brothers, and felt like a bit of an AR gimmick, more so than a full-fledged game. Like cool, it comes with a remote-controlled car, but these are gamers. They don't really want to have to move the Mountain Dew and Cheetos or dodge these things with their newly bought expensive plastic RC cars. It's something that's like fun for a time, but maybe not necessarily for like the hard gamers. And not a consistent game that you can rely on sort of thing. So it's like fun for kids and fun for a few hours, but how much longevity does it have? Especially with the performance issues that were brought by the AR gameplay. But still, Veteran Studios was still getting contracts, and thus, they were still kicking. Knockout City, on the other hand, wasn't. It got knocked out. It was shut down June 6th, 2023. And just like that, a beloved team-based dodgeball battle arena game was gone. This felt so fast, for a game that exploded onto the scene only to fizzle out so quickly later on. I, like many others, can't help but feel like, with a few tweaks and perhaps some more time in the oven, Knockout City could have been a more long-lasting knockout. The kind that comes after multiple rounds sort of thing, years, instead of relying on the flash knockout that never came in the short time that it was out. Sorry, I've been wanting to make knockout puns and analogies for ages on the channel, and here's my moment. Velan Studios would announce major layoffs March 21st, 2024, cutting up to 46 developers. The cited reason for this was a loss of contract, which would also halt their plans to expand into Montreal. This showed that the company wasn't doing so well, or at least it was trending in that direction at that moment, and their reliance on contracts as an indie developer was leaving them with an uncertain path or future in some ways. And to go back to my previous point, this is why some companies ultimately end up getting acquired or become subsidiaries, because even if that risks a shutdown or loss of their art, the risk is versus the reward, so you have to choose yours and choose your adventure. Velan Studios would deliver on their promises to return to Knockout City. Well, sort of. At the very least, they would do their community right, and their game right, by preserving it in a private server edition. This edition would launch May 2024 and be free on Steam, and it would allow players to set up matches with each other or against bots. Outside of using now terminated online servers, of course. While this might sound like a partial victory for some, it does allow the community to do the rest of the lifting, which is exactly what they did with CoCity.xyz. This is a community launcher that allows you to connect to the most populated servers from different regions. So shout out to Velan Studios for giving the community the ability to preserve the game. And shout out to the community for, like always in these multiplayer games or virtual worlds, stepping up and preserving a piece of art and digital history. Velan Studios would keep on kicking, introducing a party horror game of sorts, Midnight Murder Club, June 2024, which was a twist on hide and seek, where 6 players in a first-person experience must try to survive from the other players in a 2 vs 2 vs 2 team variant, or free-for-all. This is a clear departure from making kid-friendly content, which I think is neat. I'm a bit worried though, with how long they have been cultivating a younger audience. Is that audience looking for this? But then again, maybe they were counting on an audience having grown up, or attracting a new one altogether. Still, I can't complain, when my complaints of Knockout City were how kid-focused the game felt. Although Velan had moved on from Knockout City seemingly, they would express in June of 2024 that they still had love for the game, and they had a desire to bring it back someday. Knockout City, though, didn't have much of a universe to really return to, though, so I don't know if this is just Velan Studios being nice and respectful and trying to let people know they still care about it, or really expressing a desire to remake their old game that they still believed in. Regardless, the story of Knockout City, for now, is done. Well, at least on the official servers. You can still play it on the private server edition in case you missed it the first time around. But if you have been following the timeline thus far, you know that we have reached the end of it, and thus have gathered more than enough clues to deduce this case in full. And so, why did Knockout City die? Well, in case you missed any clues, it was visually unappealing. It had a bad business model and a value exchange with it. The developer was forced to move on due to low revenue. It differs from Dodgeball in questionable ways. It had a lack of depth in the gameplay. Sometimes going free-to-play really is the key solution to a game, or at least it was like 10 years ago. But more and more over the years, we've seen the industry trending more towards the stagnated or static models, where either you're free or you just aren't. The changing of the model seems to work at injecting back some of the players into the game, sure, but it does little to address that a paid game and a free-to-play game are monetized and thus designed differently. Knockout City eventually went free-to-play, but it never addressed the issues of the game's visuals. And if your game doesn't have good visuals, or appealing skins that don't cost $20 in packs, then you're not going to have very successful microtransactions and thus revenue generation. Fortnite works because it has a free base game, with a ton of premium content that you could pay for, if you so chose. When it cost money, it had the whole single-player survival mode component tacked onto it. The value proposition for Knockout City just wasn't really there, despite being a fun and beloved game. I know, detectives, sometimes business is but these lessons are hard, but important to study, document, and hopefully for future developers learn, so the mistakes don't get repeated yet again. Velan Studios, though mistakes or not, seems to be one of the good ones, and I wish them the best of luck in their future endeavors, lest they end up back on this series. And not the most positive of lights. If you have any suggestions for future episodes or topics for me to cover, let me know in the comments below. And if you're angry that I'm covering your game, I'm sorry. Thanks for watching.
Hostile detected. Weapons hot.